Welcome to the Spiritual Sovereign Sister podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth, Akashic Records practitioner and founder of Divine Feminine Reiki. This is a space for grounded, embodied spirituality. Spirituality is the doorway. Sovereignty is the embodiment. So before we get started today, I want to ask you something. Do you ever find yourself staying quiet to avoid being seen as difficult? Or hold back your needs so that you don't disrupt the peace? Or feeling exhausted from constantly being the nice girl? If those questions land somewhere uncomfortably familiar, then this episode is very likely for you. But before we go any further, the language in this episode may feel activating for some listeners today. And that's okay. Not every conversation is meant for every stage of the journey. So take what resonates and leave the rest. But for the women who feel drained from always feeling like they have to put on a team player face when they're quietly resentful, this conversation may feel deeply validating to you. Because within women's sovereignty, this is one of the most common and destabilizing struggles for empathic sensitive women. And if you haven't yet, I would highly recommend listening to episode 1 of What is Spiritual Sovereignty, as it really sets the tone for this episode today. And I'll put a link in the show notes to that one. But the part of you that we're discussing today is what I call your inner bitch. And it's not about cruelty or hostility. It's about the part of you that refuses self-abandonment. And when understood and integrated, it can radically change how you move through relationships. So I want to take a second here and I want to actually redefine the word bitch. Most of us know that the original use of the word bitch was simply to describe a female dog. But by the 15th century, it had shifted into a slur used to shame women, and usually targeting those perceived as too sexual, too outspoken, too difficult, or too unwilling to conform. So for over 500 years, women have been socially conditioned to associate that label with something negative. You're too assertive, you're a bitch. You're too confident, you're a bitch. You're too unwilling to tolerate nonsense? Well, that makes you a bitch. But the word became a way to police women's behavior. And while the term began to be reclaimed in more of the 90s, the psychological imprint of that conditioning runs really deep for many women as a collective wounding. Because when a word has been weaponized for centuries, that energy doesn't just disappear from the nervous system because the culture evolves. The collective shame that women feel around being labeled is often stronger than her desire for fairness or even self-respect. And that is where my own inner work began colliding with this concept in a very direct way. I noticed that I kept attracting mean girl type of friends. And my guides kept repeating a message that genuinely shocked me. I kept hearing, "You're not bitchy enough." And for a long time, I resisted that. It didn't fit my idea of spiritual language from enlightened beings. But the theme kept surfacing across completely different situations for me. And eventually, instead of arguing with the phrasing, I asked what they were pointing to. And that is when they asked me to reflect on one of the darkest periods of my life whenever I was 19. I experienced a deeply unsafe and traumatic situation involving a stalker that lasted for nearly 3 years of my life. My life became consumed by fear and court appearances and survival. I couldn't even live like a normal 19 to 21-year-old because it wasn't safe. But what my guides asked me to look at wasn't the stalker itself. I had won my case and I had overcome that challenge. But they asked me to look at the women around me at the time. Because during one of the most horrific periods of my life, I endured daily cruelty from other women, and that's putting it nicely. I was told repeatedly that I deserved what was happening to me and that I brought it on myself. This victim blaming. And even once I was interrogated for hours by a female officer who I hoped would help me, but she stated that I was responsible for my own victimization and began to ask me deeply inappropriate and humiliating questions about my own virginity and refused to help me. And at the time, I was scared. I lost all of my friends. And you want to talk about shock. Imagine if all the people around you that you called friend suddenly ghosted you and you never heard from them again. And I didn't have the courage then to advocate for myself or challenge how I was being treated back then. And years later, my Akashic guides helped me to look at that entire period of my life in a way that was really profound to me. They showed me that I had normalized unacceptable behavior because I believed that my needs for respect and safety and even dignity were somehow too much. And this is not about fighting cruelty with cruelty. It's about recognizing that self-advocacy and boundaries are not acts of hostility. They're acts of self-respect and self-love. And that period revealed something really critical. The issue wasn't simply that others behaved badly. It was that I had internalized this belief that protecting myself would somehow make me the difficult one. My fear around negative perception had overridden my instinct for self-advocacy. So instead of boundaries, I defaulted to accommodation. And that was what my guides were trying to dismantle. They are really great at using language that we resonate to or even resist to help us evolve past it. And that is a dynamic that many empathic and sensitive women know intimately, which brings me to a very important distinction that I want to make here today. Assertiveness and bitchiness are not the same thing. Assertiveness is calm and direct and not emotionally charged. It's going to sound like, I'm not comfortable with that, or I cannot hear you when you interrupt me. Bitchiness, on the other hand, is usually emotionally reactive and passive aggressive, or it's going to be laced with contempt. And it sounds like, wow, that must be nice. Or if that triggered you, then there's probably something for you to heal. That's a really popular one that I hear in the spiritual community. But one is boundary communication, and the other is emotional discharge. And confusing the two is one of the most common ways that women stay trapped in people-pleasing patterns. So your inner bitch really isn't a bitch at all. She's your inner advocate. Your inner bitch can help you with so many aspects of your life if we stop resisting her. So how she often shows up in your life is usually whenever women especially become angry. And anger is an emotion that a lot of women have been taught to push away. But your anger is not wrong. We oftentimes get caught up in the story of what's happening versus sitting with their anger long enough to determine what boundaries of ours have been crossed. So the moment that you stop reacting and start examining what your emotions are signaling, that's when your intuition comes online and guiding you towards what feels aligned. And alignment will look different in every situation. But this is a great karmic lesson for those of you that's finding yourself in these repeating situations with others. And that is where this part of you is telling you that you deserve better. And it's time to act from a place of worth. Sometimes that will look like practicing structured distance from someone, to completely cutting off someone else, to learning how to navigate communities and when to walk away completely. But by befriending your inner bitch and practicing this discernment and intuition, we are able to honor the cycles of our life without leaving our energy in the past. We instead are able to take the lessons with us, and it helps keep us in our power in future collaborations and relationships. And participating in our karmic lessons like this steers us from a place of unequal power dynamics in our relationships to harmony and reciprocity. So I want to offer you some practical Akashic Record tips to help you work with your inner bitch. So the first one is use your past situations to discover your values. I see a lot of women skip awareness and move straight into anger or self-doubt, and then they kind of stay stuck there. But a value check interrupts that pattern of getting caught up in the emotions of the story. So before reacting, it's always wonderful to pause and ask yourself, what is actually bothering me here? It's not what's happening, and it's not necessarily the other person. So you go even further and you ask, what is happening inside me right now? Meaning, what feels off or unfair or misaligned? Because your reaction is actually data for you to be able to use. And then we go one layer deeper, even under that. What is under all of this? What value of mine feels crossed? Or how do I feel disrespected? And then what would alignment look like for me with that? The second tip is to fall in love with your body. We don't realize as women just how disconnected we are from our bodies. And we don't realize how deeply comparison shapes our sense of self-worth. So when your worth feels tied to how you measure up, your appearance, your body, and how you're perceived, that's when people-pleasing becomes almost inevitable. Because validation starts to feel like a need instead of a preference. And reconnecting with your body helps to break that cycle of comparison. So beautiful, simple practices like self-massage or even taking ritual baths can be great, but mirror work can be really, really beneficial for this. It helps you to shift your attention back to your own physical experience rather than external ideals. So if you do want to try mirror work, keep it simple. Start gentle. You're going to stand in front of a mirror and you're going to say out loud something that you genuinely appreciate about your body. Start where it feels easy, and then over time start to move to parts of you that you have more difficulty with, finding what you truly appreciate about those parts, even if you don't necessarily like them. And speaking it out loud really matters because your body is always listening, and we're trying to create safety in the body again. And your own voice is very powerful as it helps to rebuild self-acceptance and internal worth when you do it like this. And the third, this one you're probably not expecting, is daydreaming. And I know it sounds silly, but a lot of women live in like this chronic state of hypervigilance and overstimulation, especially if you've experienced trauma in the past. But positive constructive daydreaming is one of the simplest ways to reconnect with yourself without force. And daydreaming also is the same energy as imagination, placing your awareness into a sixth dimensional space beyond the immediate noise of the moment. So when you're daydreaming, you can set an intention to connect with your higher self. And you can start to ask your higher self, how would my higher self have handled a situation from the past from an empowered place? And then you can actually watch that unfold in your mind's eye and notice how that version of you would have handled it differently and how that different reaction feels in your body. And you might feel resistance with that different action, but don't judge it, okay? That resistance is information itself. It often shows you the beliefs that your ego is still attached to that keeps you stuck in the same pattern. And that awareness is exactly where your inner advocate starts to come online for you. Thank you for listening to the Spiritual Sovereign Sister podcast. I hope today's episode helped you to see that your inner bitch may actually be one of your greatest sources of clarity and agency. If you're craving community with women walking a similar path, I invite you to our online Lightworker Sisterhood. We would truly love to have you there. See you in the next episode.